Should we start now, Neil?
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our seminar on full-frame filmmaking, the FX9 and the Venice cameras. Let me introduce myself. My name's Neil Thompson. I used to work for Sony for many years and before that for a while for the BBC, but I'm kind of over it now. I'm fully recovered and things are back to normal now. This is me over here. If I can point using my fantastic pointing device here. Yeah, that's me there, if you can see the screen. We're very fortunate in that we haven't got webcams, so you don't have to watch me all the time and look at me. So I'll just introduce myself using that picture over there and we can leave it at that, fortunately. So a bit about my background. I'm from an engineering background rather than a cameraman, so I have no claim to any great creativity or anything like that. That's your department. But I have been talking about cameras and how they work and that sort of thing for quite some time now, and been trying to translate the technical language into something a bit more understandable, perhaps, for people working with the cameras. Excuse me. In the background, Jake from CVP is moderating and looking out for interesting questions and so on, and he knows a great deal about the accessories and so on that work with the Sony cameras. I'm more of a Sony person myself, but I do run into a lot of the accessories myself. And also lurking in the background, we have Daniel List, who is based in Scandinavia, and he's a Sony product specialist on the FX9. And if I get anything wrong or tell you some outright lies or anything, he'll just dive in there and say, "Oi, what are you saying there, Mr. Thompson?" and correct me if I stray off the beaten path. And if I tell you anything I'm not supposed to tell you, likewise, he'll be intervening. Not that I can tell you anything I'm not supposed to tell you, because I don't really know anything. And that's kind of the way I like it in some respects. Daniel probably does know some stuff, and he will be back in either a week or 10 days' time or something like that, in order to update you all in the CVP common room on the latest updates for the FX9 camera, and indeed the Venice camera as well, because there will be further updates to that as well. It's kind of a what you would have seen at NAB kind of update, but that's now scheduled to take place on the 30th, and sometime after that, Daniel will be back to spill the beans, as it were. So that's something to look forward to. So let's get this out of the way to start with. Don't ask me if there's going to be a center crop for the FX9. I don't know. Everybody asks. The guys in Japan are well aware that people would like a center crop mode for the FX9 camera. But maybe we'll know more on the 30th. Maybe we won't. It's difficult for me to say. Daniel will update you in due course. So let's get back to the nitty-gritty of full frame. Full frame is the next big thing. We needed a next big thing, of course, because the whole industry thrives on next big things. We live and breathe by them. And the next big thing is a full frame sensor, which is a big image sensor at the front end of your camera. And everybody's building new cameras like it's gone out of fashion these days. But of course, they all need an image sensor right at the front, and that's the big decision to make right from the beginning. I have to say that Sony Corporation are quite good at making image sensors. Their image sensing division has been doing it a long time. They're pretty practiced at it, and their technology is pretty much class leading, I think, really. One thing, though, to bear in mind is that choosing the image sensor size is quite a complicated equation. If you look at all the different things that come into play, there's a bit of a balancing act goes on here. Long ago and far away, Sony used to have one of those corporate slogans that we used to have printed on polo shirts that said "choice without compromise." And of course, you can't really make a choice without making some kind of compromise. And when you're choosing the size and indeed the shape of the image sensor that goes up at the front of your camera, there are a few different things you have to balance out. So there's the physics that comes into play. And even Sony Corporation can't bend the rules of physics. They're pretty much pretty strict, really. And that's going to affect things like the depth of field of your sensor, the dynamic range, the sensitivity of the sensor and the noise performance. All these things, again, even within the realm of physics, all balance off against each other. And it's a question of choosing the right balance. At the same time, we have to look at display technology as well, and the shape of the image sensor. Now, this used to be an easy choice. In the olden days, it was 4:3, and then we went to the wild and wacky world of 16:9 widescreen, and we've been pretty much stable in that world for a long time. That's kind of gone by the wayside to a certain extent. We're not as fixed onto a particular aspect ratio as we used to be. We've got Ultra HD in 16:9, we've got 4K in 17:9, we've got CinemaScope at 2.39:1. We've got Netflix, who are quite keen on aspect ratios like 2:1. You could shoot in square aspect ratio. And some of these Instagram kind of things, which me being an old git, I'm not entirely comfortable with, are things like 5:4 or 4:5, or depending on which way around you hold your camera. So it's not like it used to be in that there was just 16:9. Your sensor needs to be more flexible up at the front. And you just have to think of it perhaps more as an area of sensing semiconductor to do different things with, if you like. So we need to be a bit more flexible up at the front with the camera rather than just being good old 16:9. So there are also manufacturing limitations to take into account. The physical size of the sensor, you can't go embiggening and embiggening it. That's a good Simpsons word, is embiggening, if you're not familiar with it. And there's a limit to how big you can make a slab of silicon. In the olden days with CCDs, 2/3 inch was about as big as you could get without it all going horribly wrong. CMOS sensors, manufacturing process has got a lot easier, but at the same time, there's still another balancing act to get round, which is the amount of heat generated, which is dependent on to a certain extent on the speed you're trying to clock information out of the sensor, the transfer speed that you're trying to achieve, the amount of noise that you think is acceptable. So all these things have to be balanced out. And the final bit of the jigsaw, if you like, is the lens design that it's designed to work with. Choosing the image sensor size, you've got to have a lens that will cover that full sensor size. You keep making it bigger, the piece of glass at the front end keeps getting bigger. And there's a limit to how cost effectively large you can make your image sensor lens size. And of course, there's a trade-off as well in terms of range of zoom. You keep embiggening your sensor and your piece of glass gets a lot bigger, and the range of your lens gets smaller. So if you're hoping to put a 105 times zoom on the front end of your full frame camera to do the World Cup, you can possibly think again. 105 times zoom on full frame would be about the size of a Sprinter van and about 30 times more expensive. It just would not physically work. We're still going to need 2/3 inch and smaller sizes and different sizes for different applications. But there is most certainly room for full frame in the market. And the next thing I want to look at is why full frame is what it is. So if you go back in time into the world of celluloid, typically a strip of film was 35mm across, 35mm film, we're all pretty familiar with, I guess. And in the olden days, we used to drag that piece of film through our stills cameras with a satisfying ratchety thing with a lever on the top right-hand corner of the camera. Now that was a proper bit of equipment, that. And you drag your roll of film through your gate of your camera in a horizontal direction. So if you look at the width of the film, you couldn't really use the full 35 mils of the width of the film because there are sprocket holes in the way. So typically about the maximum you could use would be about 24mm. And if you then choose a sensible sort of aspect ratio to go with that, you're about 36mm wide in a sort of a 3:2 aspect ratio. So that would be what your 35mm stills film would be traditionally, the image size of it. And keep an eye on those numbers, 36:24. They're very much part of the full frame business. So 36mm by 24mm in our 35mm stills camera. And then the next stage that came along was making our digital stills cameras. And obviously the Canon 5D Mark II was a bit of a trendsetter here, but there are many other stills cameras, and they've all gone down a very similar route. And to use the same glass at the front end, they've chosen the same image sensor size and have stuck a 36mm by 24mm sensor in the front of a stills camera. And then the next thing to happen was that stills cameras also made moving pictures because they could. And we started to see the influx of full frame into the moving pictures world. And traditionally, full frame hasn't been a moving pictures thing, really, to be honest. In the world of moving pictures, we've always dragged the film through the camera in the other direction. That might be to do with being able to stick a big can of film on the top of the camera instead of at the side of it, which would be very clumsy. But anyway, what we're doing here is we're dragging a piece of film through the gate in the vertical direction, which of course means that the image size is the horizontal size can be 24mm. So the size of a full frame, well, no, not you wouldn't call it a full frame, a Super 35 3x film gate would be about 24mm across by 13 to 14 high, which is about 28mm diagonal. So 35mm in movies world has always been different to 35mm in stills world, if that makes sense. So we have these two sort of different areas of technology. And then, of course, we have what we're used to in the video world, where we have the world of, traditionally in my background, 2/3 inch image sensors. Your shoulder mount camcorder would have a 14.5mm diagonal, something of sorry, the next one up is the 2/3 inch sensor. Alongside 2/3 inch, we've had Super 16 for film, and we've had Super 35. And now we've moved to the world of full frame in either 16:9, 17:9 format, or using the full open gate 3x2 sort of area. So we've always had a lot of image sensor sizes. And of course, there are others, 4/3 inch, 1 inch, 1/3 inch, 1/4 inch, and so on. So there's always been a lot of choice, but here's an extra choice. So why would we choose it? Well, we've been getting along pretty well for quite some time now with Super 35mm cameras, where we have the FS5, the FS7, the F5, the F55, all using basically a similar kind of image sensor size. But we've moved on, and now we have the A7, A9 series stills cameras. We're first out of the block using these sensors, and as I mentioned, it came from the stills world. And since then, they've been joined by a couple more big hitters, like the Venice camera and now the FX9, which is the most recent addition to the family. And again, 36mm by 24mm is the number to keep an eye on, all using basically the same size of image sensor and pretty much the same sort of size of lens, of course, to go on top of it, but with different lens mounts. The A series cameras using the E mounts, the FX9 using the E mount, and the Venice using both the PL mount and the E mounts, both lens mounts built into the same camera by a cunning bit of design. So that's where we are with the full frame family at the moment. But why should we follow stills with the video world? Is there any particular good reason to do that? Well, you could argue that some of it is because we can. And that's always, in the development of new technology, a factor. If there's something we can do, then you can be pretty sure someone's going to suggest we do it, because the technology is already there. And perhaps more importantly, by moving into the video, into the stills frame world, you can access a huge range of full frame lenses that are already there, developed and ready to be used. Maybe not all of them ideal for video production, but it gives you a lot of interesting choices and a lot of possibilities in terms of glass to put on the front of your camera. And the final point is that, of course, bigger sensors are better, which we all know, don't we? Or are they? Is there any particular reason why they are? And that's what we're going to look at next. So if you put a bigger image sensor up at the front, what you get is more surface area to have bigger pixels. and that might be a good thing. Or you get more area to fit more pixels, which might also be a good thing. You can have full frame lenses, which I've just mentioned, and you get a different look to the images, which we'll discuss in more detail in a minute. So there's a lot of possibilities here. But first of all, let's look at the general theory that if you make your big image sensor bigger, you can enlarge your pixels, which is very true. Bigger pixels. So bigger pixels better? In general, probably yes, though perhaps maybe not quite for the reason that people automatically think. I think people, sorry, the other thing you can do is rather than make the pixels bigger, is you can put more of them on there and keep them the same size, or maybe shrink them down a bit and get a lot more on there. You can adjust on test, and getting that balance right is probably the most difficult thing. It's all about choosing the right compromise again. So if you make your pixels bigger, in theory, you get better sensitivity and better dynamic range out of it. Now that's true to a certain extent, but technology keeps moving on, and the sensitivity and the dynamic range of smaller pixels keeps getting better and better. By adding more pixels, and additionalizing is a new word, you can get more resolution out of the sensor. And that's kind of self-evident, really. More pixels is pretty much equating to more resolution. But it also gives you more aspect ratio flexibility, which is what I was talking about before, where you don't want to be tied down too much to just 16:9 or any particular aspect ratio in particular, really. You want to have a bit more flexibility. And by putting more pixels on there, you can do that. Just looking at sensitivity and pixel size, I just want to go to the theory that if you put more pixels on, if you go from HD over here to Ultra HD with approximately 4 times as many photo sites, to be more precise, rather than pixels, with 4 times as many photo sites on it, then your pixels are a quarter of the size. So, they're going to be a quarter of the sensitivity because they're only getting a quarter of the amount of light. Except that's not strictly true. If you look at it in a different way, if you think about the number of photons falling on this square here, and the number of photons falling on this square here, I'm afraid my drawing with a cursor on a mouse is pretty terrible, but I should get a graphics tablet, I think. But if you look at the number of photons falling on each area, it's exactly the same. And you're capturing them all and using them all. So why would your sensitivity be any different when you increase the number of pixels? Well, in theory, it shouldn't. There's no technical reason why putting more small pixels on would reduce your sensitivity. Although actually, there are some plumbing issues. If you think about the wires and the bits that go between the photosensitive sites that get the information out of the front of the image sensor, they take up space, and all the photons that fall on the gaps in between are wasted. Now you can optimize your image sensor by putting things like on-chip lenses on the front of there, and that will focus the pixels onto the sensor and make the best use of them. But there will always be some amount of wastage. And the more pixels you put on the front of there, the slightly more proportion of the area of the sensor is taken up by the plumbing rather than the active photosensor area. So that's actually why you lose a bit of sensitivity. But at the same time, the technology improves, and things like on-chip lenses and the way the sensor is arranged and read out from the back of the sensor and so on, that Sony is a particular specialist on, all improve this kind of stuff. So it's 2 steps forward and 2 steps back sort of thing. So it evens out as the new technology comes along. One thing that the new technology does also give us, though, is this mysterious function of dual ISO, which is a function of both the FX9 and the Venice camera. On the Venice camera, you could mysteriously change the base ISO, the base sensitivity of the camera, from 500 to 2500 ISO, which is pretty exciting. And the FX9 has kind of taken that a little further, and is either an ISO of 800 or 4000, depending on your choice, really. Now, this is assuming you're in log mode. The sensitivity quoted for the log mode of acquisition. It's a bit different if you're using a normal style gamma curve, a TV gamma curve. But this dual ISO business is kind of like free game. In old money, there used to be a little toggle switch on the side of the camera marked 0, 6 and 12 or 0, 9 and 18 dBs. And when you ran out of light, you turned up the gain and you paid for it with noise. Now you can change the ISO, the base ISO of the camera, from 800 to 4000 ISO at the flick of a button, and you can put it on an assignable button on the camera. And you get free gain. You're supposed to pay for it with noise. And you do to a very, very tiny extent, but it's kind of like free gain. And it works extremely well. I have somewhere, if I can just divert off for a minute. Just excuse me a second. Yeah, if I've got Catalyst Browse open here with a clip here where I've got hopefully you can see this here. If I have the sensor running in lower sensitivity and turn it up to high, and then put the ND filter in and get back to where we were. So we're now running at high sensitivity at 4000 ISO, and you have to see if you can spot the difference in the noise performance. So if I go back to low sensitivity and take the ND out, can you see any difference? Is it less grain? It should be. It's very, very, very marginal. If I go back up to high sensitivity again in a second, there we go, at 4000 ISO, and then put the ND in to bring it down again to the correct exposure. And does it look noisy? I don't think so. It obviously it's a little difficult for you guys to see on computer monitors and so on, but on my nice in my home office, as it were, it looks very clean indeed. So that's what the dual ISO system is doing for us. Now, if I go back to my presentation here, oops. Sorry, I just need to skip forward a bit. Bear with. So we have a choice then. You can make the pixels bigger, or you can keep them the same size and just stick more. And this is what Sony has chosen to do with the FX9. The actual pixel pitch and dimensions are pretty much the same as they were on the FS7. But what has changed is the technology's improved, so the noise performance has got better, and the dual ISO has come along to enable us to get this mysterious extra gain out of the system. And because we've now got this larger surface area, we can put more pixels on there. Our resolution has increased as well. That is if we use the full size of the image sensor. So those are the choices we've made, and hopefully it's all worked out for the best. But looking back at this dual ISO, sorry if I just go back a stage there, a lot of people are asking sort of, if I need to get more light out of the camera because we've run out of light and it's getting late, should I go to the high ISO or should I put more gain in? And the answer to that is use the high ISO. If the high ISO takes you above the exposure that you're after, is it better to go above and then come down with the ISO rating, or is it better just to put a little gain into the system? And that's a slightly different question and a little more complicated. And it depends really what you're aiming to achieve. In the olden days with the FS7, there was a general acceptance that you expose to the right, and in general you would slightly overexpose your image to keep it out of the noise, and that was the correct way to go. You could argue that that's not really necessary with the FX9. With the FX9, it's a very quiet image sensor, and if you keep it at its rated ISO of 800 in log mode, and just shoot as you were without putting any exposure index change in there, you'll be perfectly okay. You're far enough from the noise to keep the pictures nice and clean. And at the same time, that means you've got lots of headroom. You've got lots of room at the top for highlight overexposure. And particularly in this world of high dynamic range, if you're shooting an HDR project, the more you move to the right, the less room you've got for extreme highlights and speculars in shot. So in general, whereas with the FS7, the general rule was expose to the right and rate your camera at 1000 ISO, 2000 ISO. Not necessarily so with the FX9, and indeed same rule applies with the Venice as well. Just treat them as working at their rated ISO straight out of the box and you'll be fine, said a Sony spokesman. Don't sue me. Yeah, so in general, treat it as though Sony got the ISO rating. And if you need to hold highlights, keep it on a low base ISO and go up. And if you need to keep clean shadow detail, use a high ISO and come down, if that makes sense. That's a general working rule that seems to work okay. Just a word on the native ISO of the camera. Please don't forget that although it's rated at 800 and 4000 in the world of log over here, just excuse me a second while I get the pen enabled. So for log working with a log gamma curve, it's rated at 800 and 4000 ISO. But if you use a normal gamma curve, for instance, the Cinetone gamma curve that's built into the camera now, which is very nice, that will give you a lower ISO rating. And basically, that will be about 320 ISO as its native low sensitivity mode. But of course, you've got the high sensitivity mode where you can just press the button and works equally as well in log as it does in gamma. So, this thing of aspect ratio flexibility. You've got a big old sensor up at the front, 36 by 24 millimeters. In this particular case, we're just using the Venice cameras. And this sensor is a 3x2 image sensor. So who's shooting in 3x2? Probably not very many of you. And that's not really the point. As I said before, what this sensor does is gives you a lot of options. And Sony always provides you with a splendid diagram on the brochure that looks something like this, that confuses the hell out of just about everybody. And that gives you a list of your options with the Venice, which is all perfectly straightforward, as you can see. Or is it? Possibly not. Maybe it isn't quite as clear as it ought to be. So what I did was I tried to break it down a bit into something a little sensible. So here's your native open gate image sensor, 24mm by 36 and 6,000 pixels across by 4,000 wide. Why choose that number of pixels? Well, part of the reason is so that when you cut the image sensor down to Super 35, you end up with still having 4096 by 2160, a 4K image sensor. Basically, when you cut down to Super 35, the image is the same size and has the same number of pixels as your f5 or your f55 or your FS7, or indeed your C300 or your Panasonic Varicam or whatever it may be, a typical sort of Super 35 4K image sensor size. So what we have here is a camera that works in two different modes, full frame and Super 35. And the Super 35 mode has two variants. There's the 16:9 flavor, which is the inside box, and the 17:9 flavor, the 4K rather than the UHD, which is the outside frame there. And it's extremely useful to have this mode of operation available to you. So at the touch of a button, it's very quick to change over. You just press the Super 35 button in the menus and Bob's your uncle. Your image sensor size is Super 35mm. And that does mean that if you've got a whole set of Super 35 lenses to go with your FS7, you could transfer them straight over and carry on using them on your FX9. So if you've got a set of Fujinon MK zooms or something, which are a lovely bit of glass, you stick them on the front of your FX9, still E-mount, switch it to Super 35 mode, and Bob's your uncle, away you go. And nobody's any the wiser. And they will look splendid on the front of the camera. You don't have to use full frame all the time. It's an option that's there for you when you need it, if you see what I mean. Here's some other options. And this is an option on the Venice camera. And there's two flavors of it. And these are the anamorphic flavors of the Venice camera. And these are tall rather than wide. And that's the basic rule with anamorphic. If you can make a tall sensor, Arri typically do it with a 4x3 sensor, 4x5, which is a little bit taller. And those cutouts, those frame sizes, work particularly well with anamorphic lenses. So if I go to the world of anamorphic, I'll just skip forward a second. If we have a 4x3 image sensor and we have a 2 times anamorphic on the front of it, that will make it, instead of 4x3, it will be 8x3, which is 2.67 to 1, which is a bit wider than CinemaScope. And you put a couple of frame markers in there and away you go, and you chop the edges off in post-production and Bob's your uncle. If you want to do it a bit more neatly, you could use the 6x5 image sensor cell. And you take the 6 and you times it by the 2 and you get a 12x5 image sensor. And 12 divided by 5 is 2.4 to 1. 2.4 to 1 is, as near as damn it, exactly right for CinemaScope, 2.39 to 1, which is a nice, neat and tidy solution. So for those of you shooting anamorphic, which I imagine is everybody in the days, the Venice camera has a couple of really neat solutions. 4x3 if you wanted to do it the traditional way, if you like. 6x5 if you want to do it a bit more neatly and tidily and make the best of the vertical resolution available to you. So that's a good solution. So those are the two anamorphic modes here. These two green frames, if you like. Also in the Venice, there's a couple of full frame 16x9, 17x9 and 1.85 modes. There's even a full frame width 2.39 to 1 CinemaScope mode, the purple one here. So if you want to shoot with circular lenses straight to CinemaScope, there's your option. And if you ever have a Venice camera and just switch into it, just makes it look expensive. I don't know why, it just does. You can charge your client an extra 30% on the bill for that. Just press the button, CinemaScope, and just use circular lenses. Obviously, you don't get the lens artifacts, the flaring, and the bokeh of your anamorphic lenses, but to me, it just looks nice. So there are some options with the Venice camera. I'll skip through some of them and come to the options with the full frame sensor on the FX9 camera. Not quite as many options on the FX9. The FX9 is 6048 by 3200 high, so it's not quite as high as the image sensor in the Venice camera. Although all the rest of it is still there, it's just not used. So this bit is still here, but at the moment we only use the full frame mode in 16x9 or in a slightly further down the line development 17x9. But strangely enough, that full sensor is there and you can see it if you peer down the front of the lens. And strangely enough, if you click the ND filter in as it goes whir clunk as it initially engages, you can see that the filter allows you to see the full height of the frame. So there is kind of a way forward into the world of anamorphic there. Not that I have any information that they're going to do that, absolutely, but it's just pure speculation, idle speculation, just people peering down the front of the lens and thinking, oh, I wonder. There may be a possibility in the future of going to anamorphic mode. You never know. But that's certainly not on the agenda at the moment. At the moment, you have 16x9 and 17x9 in full frame. The 17x9 is a little way down the road yet in a future software version. and you have 16 by 9 and 17 by 9 in Super 35. And it all kind of makes sense. So you've got the same 16 by 9, 17 by 9 Super mode that it's FS7 mode, if you like, these two modes here. So you can work exactly as you did with your FS7, but you get all the advantages of the new technology, increased dynamic range, the dual ISO, the autofocus, and all that kind of stuff. But you can just treat it as though it was an FS7 to some extent. Or you can use the full frame. Now, the trouble with using the full frame is that the more of the sensor you use, the more pixels you have to read out, the faster you have to clock it, and the harder it is. An important factor to remember is that you can only read out the full 6K full frame mode up to 25 or 30 frames a second. You can't do 50 or 60 frames a second at the full frame. Clocking speed's too fast. So we have a bit of an oddity in the middle here. Is something that's on the map. I don't know when this particular bit of the map will be coloured in, but it is on the map that there will be a 5K mode, and that is simply there to go as big as we possibly can and still allow you to clock out at 50 or 60 frames a second. So if you want 50 or 60 frames a second, the only way to do that at full frame, although it's not quite full frame, is to do it at 5K. That's the maximum size you can clock out of at those frame rates. And that is a little bit further down the line. So as you can see, there's quite a few different options in terms of the real estate of the image sensor up the front on this camera, which knocks onto frame rates, recording and resolution and all that kind of stuff. So as I say, the more photo sites you have to read out, the longer it takes. And that gives us sort of two different modes of working, as it were. And you used to think of the resolution of a camera as just being one number. Unfortunately, it's got a little bit more complicated these days now. And we have to think of two resolutions. One is how we're reading the sensor out, and two is how we're recording that resolution. So the two slightly different things. So we can read out the image sensor at 6K, or we will be able to read it out at 5K at 50p or 60p. We can read it out at 4K or 2K, and we can record at 4K or 3840 by 2160 or good old-fashioned 1920 by 1080. It sounds a bit complicated having all these things to think about, but actually, if you look in the menus, it's for once in Sony menus, they kind of made it reasonably simple. In your menu, you choose your frame rate, you choose how you would scan the image sensor mode, full frame 6K, Super 35, full frame 2K, which is where you're subsampling the full frame in order to go faster. Super 35 at 2K, where you're subsampling Super 35 in order to go faster. So you choose your readout mode, and then you choose your resolution. At the moment, 3840 by 2160 will be typically the resolution you're using. There will be the option to do 4096 by 2160 in a future software version. And you choose your codec to go with it. Now, you may have spotted, and a prize for everyone who spotted this, is that there isn't a 6K recording mode. So you can clock the image sensor out at 6K, but you can't record it at 6K, just at UHD or 4K. And the reason for that, the reason for that is because you kind of really don't need to record it at 6K. Because we're clocking the image sensor out at 6,000 samples across, those 6,000 samples across are photosets, if you like, and respond to light. They don't respond to colour. In order to get colour information out of the camera, we have to do the usual trick with gluing bits of cellophane on the front of our pixels. It may be a slightly more sophisticated process than that. And if we do that, we can generate colour information by using a Bayer pattern on the front. But we're dividing our resolution between the three colour channels here. So we're losing some resolution. So although we may have a big 4K sticker on the side of our camera to say 4096 samples across, those 4096 samples have to be shared between. And there's a downsampling factor, if you like, which you can argue till the cows come home, but about a factor of 0.7 is about realistic. So about 0.7, 70% of that 4096 resolution actually gets through, which means that actually when you're sampling the sensor at 4K, you're actually getting a 2.8K resolution image. But then if you sample at 6K and times it by 0.7, you just get 4.2K resolution, which matches pretty much perfectly the recording resolution of 4K. So there's actually no real need to have a 6K sampling system, a 6K recording mode, despite the fact that you're sampling the image at 6K. The image size is still the same full frame size, and it's still being sampled and then super sampled before being recorded. And this does mean that your recording modes, by happy coincidence, end up being pretty much exactly as they were with an FS or FS7 Mark II, which is quite neat and tidy. So let's get on to the world of lenses. We need to find a lens now that's going to cover that big sensor for us. And I can remember trying to find big lenses that covered Super 35 sensors for the World Cup a few years ago in Brazil when Sony decided to do it in 4K. And it was a bit of a chore. And you're trying to get big zooms and you end up with a monster like that on the front of your camera. Let me tell you, it isn't going to get any easier with course. And if you want one lens that's going to do everything for you all day long, you're going to be struggling, I'm afraid. We were looking for that for Super 35, and I think maybe the nearest we got was the original Cabrios or the Canon CN7, which were pretty chunky bits of glass and pretty heavy. So there is no one lens that's going to. I say that. I say I'm just going to skip ahead to this fella here, the 28 to 135 from, which may be the lens that everybody's been dreaming of. For every no, it's not the perfect lens. It's far from it. It's best you can say for it is maybe quirky, but it's interesting. It's useful, and you may recognize this lens from such cameras as the FS7 Mark I, and it was the kit lens for the FS7 Mark I. And it was a bit of an oddity because this is a full frame lens. And of course, the FS7 Mark I is a Super 35 camera. So it made an image size bigger than the Super 35 sensor of the FS7. So it was a bit of a weird one. And you were looking for a 28mm wide angle performance. But of course, there's a crop factor of 1.5 to take into account there, which made it a lot wider than people were expecting. And it also has some quirks as well. So for instance, if you crank it round to do a crash zoom, nothing much happens for about 10 minutes while the motor thinks, oh, I should be going now. And then off it trundles and arrives about 20 minutes later. It's a fly-by-wire sort of zoom sort of function, which is a bit odd. But having said that, it's kind of come into its own, this lens. You put this on the front of the FX9, and it is indeed the kit lens. If you buy the K for kit version of the FX9, you'll get this lens with it. And you can click this little Irish ring backwards and forwards, and it goes into auto and autofocus or servo assisted mode or good old fashioned manual mode if you pull it back. It's optically pretty damn good. And if you change focus, you get hardly any breathing, which is quite a surprise. It's got image stabilization built into it. And it's a manual Irish ring, and it's actually pretty good. But of course, it's one of those try before you buy things. Borrow one of somebody, find one on eBay that's going cheap and or buy that or something. But they're not an expensive lens, and they're worth a look. As usual in the world, it's shades of grey. There is no one perfect thing. I'm afraid the internet these days is a very bipolar world where something's either God's gift to everybody, or it's an appalling piece of rubbish that the manufacturer should be ashamed of. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground. But actually, this lens is actually worth a look if you want a general purpose, decent zoom length, reasonable wide angle, and of course works extremely well with the autofocus functions of X9, which I'll come to in a little bit. But in that search for the perfect lens, there's a useful website here, actually, I've trolled across. It's not like Sony to make a useful website, but I did actually stumble upon this and thought it might be of interest. If you go to this website, it tells you the PXW FX9. You can select different models here, and it will tell you the range of compatibility between any given lens. And it tells you, for instance, that this particular lens, the steady shot's not supported. It's a Super 35 APS-C size, and software versions and so on. So it tells you what's going to work, what isn't going to work with an FX9, which is dead handy, really. I thought you might possibly be interested in that. There's another lens by this chap here who's done a lot of work sorting out all the lenses from Sony, as well as all the other manufacturers, not just the Sony lenses, all the manufacturers' E-mount lenses that work with the FX9. But perhaps best of all is the CVP lens coverage tool, which will while away a few hours of lockdown time for anybody, I'm sure. Excuse me. And Jake and the guys have put a lot of effort into this. And basically, you can select your preferred camera manufacturer. That would be Sony, the Sony Corporation. Select your preferred camera model. We'll go for the FX9. Select your format, and we want to see what covers the full frame image mode here. And then we select the lens manufacturer. I'm going to go Fujinon and see if my Cabrio 19-90 will work. And if I've got that at its full wide angle, let's have a look. Oh dear, it's a catastrophe. But it's a very useful catastrophe. It tells you exactly what's going to work in terms of lens coverage. So here we can see that the Fujinon Cabrio is of course, it's a Super 35mm lens. So it's going to vignette in full frame mode, but then you can switch to Super 35 mode and it will fill the screen. But I can strongly recommend this image lens coverage tool that the guys at CVP have put together. So moving along, as an example, kit lens. Oh, I just want to come back to the world of speed boosters, and this is a very popular subject when the f5, 55, and adapting full frame lenses to work on Super 35mm cameras was a very popular route to go. And companies like Metabones did very well making these speed boosters that that change the image size to a smaller Super 35mm size. And speed boosters were very popular for these cameras. Just wanted to mention that you can still use them on the FX9. It sounds a bit counterintuitive and illogical, but if you have the FX9 set to Super 35 mode, you can still put full frame lenses on there, and it will work perfectly well. And you'll still get that full frame look from your image by using a full frame lens, speed booster down to Super 35 and leaving the camera. Still get the look of full frame. But there's a couple of reasons you might want to try it. You might not. If you wanted a full frame look at 50p. So I mentioned before that your camera will only go up to 25 or 30 frames full frame. But if you put it in Super 35, it'll go up to 50p, bung a speed booster on the front, and you get the full frame look at 50p. Bob's your uncle. Also, just a quick word about rolling shutter. The Venice camera, of course, has a global shutter, and there is no rolling shutter. There is a small amount of rolling shutter. Drastic, it's pretty minimal, really. But if you want to keep it to the absolute minimum, the trick to do is to read out a smaller area of the sensor. And in order to do that, you would work in Super 35 mode. But if you wanted to keep the full frame look, but keep the rolling shutter to an absolute minimum, then perhaps you might want to use a speed booster. I don't know, it's just a thought. Skip through there. I just want to say a quick word about depth of field. And of course, this is the big reason for going to a full frame sensor. Everybody wants the shallow depth of field look. And there are a couple of things that change your depth of field. changing the focal length of the lens, changing the aperture, and changing the subject distance. You may notice that changing the size of your image sensor isn't on that list. And actually, changing the size of the image sensor doesn't actually make a difference. If you imagine a full frame sensor and then you crop it to micro four thirds, half the width, half the height, you're just chopping out a chunk, just like you would do if you went from full frame to Super 35 mode or something. The numbers are a bit easier, full frame and 4/3. You chop out a chunk out the middle, and you can't actually change the depth of field by doing that, because it's the same image. You're just using a different. It can't possibly change the depth of field. What does change, of course, is your angle of view changes when you crop down to your 4/3 inch size. And in order to regain that same angle of view, you then have to change the focal length of the lens. So you change the focal length of the lens to half of what it was, and that is what gives you the deep depth of field that when you use a smaller image sensor. It isn't so much the smaller image sensor on its own, it's the fact that in order to maintain the same angle, you have to change the focal length, and it's the changing of the focal length that actually changes the depth of field. I know it's not important really, I guess, in the end result. Sometimes it's useful to understand why exactly these things are happening. What you could do then is open the iris by 2 stops, and that will, because you're changing the aperture, and put some ND in, and Bob's your uncle back where you started from, back to the original image, which is nice. But then, of course, that's always assuming that you've got 2 stops available on your lens, and that is most likely not going to be the case, because the lens that opens up to f1.4 is the one that has the massive price tag on it, and of course you're always operating most of the time on the wide end of the lens anyway, so that's not really going to happen. But in theory, you could just open the lens 2 stops and shoot it micro 4/3. You could also move twice as far away, but then you get this perspective change, and that gets a bit complicated in terms of what's going on. So the things that change the depth of field are the things that sort of change the angle of divergence of these rays here. And moving your focal length out to a longer focal length will change the angle of divergence and bring these yellow triangles kind of sucked in and reduce your depth of field. Moving the camera closer to your subject will change the angle of divergence of these rays. And equally, changing the aperture. So if you increase the size of this hole here, then that also increases the angle of divergence of these rays and brings the field in. So those are the things that actually make the difference. I won't go into that at the moment. So in the garage, I put up my friend the Puffin here, and this is shot full frame, 100mm from about 1 meter away. And then if I change to Super 35 and change to 65mm or thereabouts, we're regaining the same angle, but at Super 35 rather than full frame. So that gives you a little idea of the difference that we're getting between Super 35 and full frame. And Super 35 and full frame. And the difference there, of course, is the background blur, the depth of field. Some people would call it the bokeh. I argue that the bokeh is more to do with the way the lens flares and goes out of focus in terms of the elements of the lens interfering with the scene. The depth of field change because of the focal length change, but nevertheless, it changes the look of the image, and that's what you're paying for. So there's your full frame, and there's your Super 35. I'll just skip through that a little bit there. So in summary, a full frame is not always the answer, but it does give you lots of options. It gives you a shallow depth of field effectively. It doesn't actually change the depth of field in itself, it's the change in the focal length. It gives you lots of frame size options, gives you readout speeds, all sorts of readout speeds. a huge choice of lenses, and the ability to switch easily. The camera doesn't even reboot. You just press the button, click, and it's there into Super 35 mode. And at the same time, as your sensor changes the number of pixels there, the efficiency of those pixels increases. So although the pixel size has effectively stayed about, you're getting more efficiency out of it because of the new changes in efficiency and technology. You're getting the autofocus, the dual ISO range out of the camera. Right, I'll pause there. There's a lot of stuff. If anybody wants to ask any questions about focus, about variable ND, about the look of the image and that sort of stuff. The main theme of today is Super 35. But if anyone wants to look at any particular aspect of the FX9 in particular or something like that, then you're very welcome to do so. And just say the word, folks, and we'll have a little look at, well, pretty much anything you want on the FX9. Okay. Any questions at all? Oh, I've got a question from Daniel there. Where are we?
Yeah, Daniel's been pretty on top with responding to the questions I've been putting in the chat, and I've been responding to them on
oh,
YouTube
fantastic!
Already, so
see, I've been so concentrated on just chuntering away here. I haven't really looked at the questions. If you can just give me a second, I'll just catch up on the question. Questions that people have been talking about. So a few questions about the removable sensor block on the Venice, which is our feature. So do things like the highlight roll off change. Yeah. Yeah, I think Daniel's pretty much covered the questions there, I think.
Yeah, he's done a good job of them.
Good, well done.
Yeah, sorry,
thank you, Daniel.
Didn't want to steal your thunder.
What does the resolution of a lens refer to, like 4K lens? Shouldn't be referred to just to the, and then it cuts off. But I hate this term. I hate lenses being called like by resolution, because there are so many older lenses that resolve enough for 4K sensors.
This is always has been a tricky one, right from the days we went to D. People always said, "Can we use the standard def lenses?" And the answer really was, if you've got a really good standard def lens, then yes, you can.
Yeah.
Equally, there were lots of quite poor SD lenses that would justify the move, but same rules apply, I think, with HD and 4K.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, we have our own entire in-house lens testing suites. We have a projector, collimator, everything. Yeah, we have a lens engineer. So over the years I've been at CVP, I've tested hundreds of lenses, and then, there are lenses from the 80s that can resolve enough to cut, for 8K even, but they're not branded as such. So yeah, you need to be careful of what, when a brand does say it's 4K or 8K already or whatever, what that actually means. So yeah, I mean, same with everything. You need to test it first. So yeah, before you make an investment, a lot of the lenses that say like 4K ready will be mainly broadcast lenses. A lot of cinema lenses won't say that. So, but I mean, yeah, just make sure you test your lens first. Get it on a projector, see what it can actually render. And yeah.
Yeah, and you've got a lens projector, haven't you, down at your?
Yeah. We've just upgraded it. So we've just got the new Croziel one, which actually can project out up to 65mm. So that way we can actually see past full frame coverage for all the full frame lenses that we test regularly. Whereas before we were using older what was it, Gecko projector, which was maxed out at full frame. I think it actually had a little bit of vignetting on full frame, because I remember when we put like tallies on there, they would even vignette, and they definitely shouldn't be vignetting at full frame. So yeah, I'm really excited to get back in the office and actually have a go on it.
Yeah, because I haven't yet. A bit of German optical engineering. You can't beat it, really.
No, it's good. There's a couple more coming in. I know this isn't particular. I know this isn't the particular topic right now, but I can't seem to find an answer anywhere. Sony says their XAVC codec is based on level 5.2 of H.264. So how is this possible to have XAVC-I?
Where's that question?
It's on YouTube. I'll put it in Discord
Oh,
for
it's
you.
on YouTube.
2 seconds.
Sorry, I haven't got
That's
the
right.
YouTube one.
Oh, and then there's a second part to it, which is that there.
Oh, I've seen it come through now. Yeah. No, in H.264 isn't inherently in interframe. I thought it was no. H.264 can be both. So it's still an H.264 compression in the long group of pictures mode as well. Sorry, yeah. So it's still long. It's still part of the family, even though it's intraframe. I could. I'll probably have to look up the XAVC spec actually on that. I have got a document, but which I'll send to that guy who's asked that question.
Cool.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I do believe that the XAVC codecs there are two different brands. First of all, the XAVCI was developed in 2012, while the XAVC Long was developed in 2014. So in those 2 years, that gap, I believe there's two different classifications of the X2C, the H.264. So I think that's one of the reasons, but I'm not an engineer, so I don't want to claim that I know the answer specifically, but it's just based on the history regarding those development of the codecs. I think that's one of the reasons why there might not be a document or it might be confusing to different the different codecs and their information. So it's not really a brilliant answer to that question because I don't know the answer to it. But based on the history of when these codecs were introduced, there are two different kinds, and some NLEs behave very differently on the if you choose long op compared to if you've recorded in XAVC Intra, because the decoding is also very, very differently, and definitely difficult when doing decoding of long op compared to decoding Intra. So I hope that has a positive answer to the question.
I'll double check that actually and come back to the comments and add later afternoon if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you it'll be after we finish the stream today, we can just comment in the put it on the YouTube there. Like put it on the YouTube link if someone wants to have a little read at it.
On that subject, I think a lot of people are a bit down on XAVCL, the long group of pictures variant of it. But from an engineering point of view, I've always thought it was a very good solution. And if you look back to sort of MPEG-2, that was always a long op solution, though people tend to have forgotten that. And admittedly, it puts a little more strain on the hardware infrastructure of the post-production community. But it's a very efficient way of encoding and gives you, in theory, high quality for a particular bit rate. So I'm quite a fan of XAVCL, but I do understand that there are people in the post-production community who are not so enamored of it, but there you go.
So yeah, Crossworks is coming with another, should I say, difficult question. How is it possible that a mirrorless full-frame camera in DSLR format is able to outperform a dedicated camcorder like the FX9 in 4K 50p? I'm intrigued to what camera he's thinking of.
Is it? In what respect? I mean, it's possible that given a particular image, you can choose a particular image where in one case the mirrorless camera will give you a better image. But on average, I don't think that's really the case. If you sort of average it out, most of the time, the FX9 is going to win out. Oh, sorry, have I misunderstood the question there? I think it was something in 4K 50p.
I'll put it in Discord, yeah. I'll ask him what camera he's referring to.
But if I could if I'm allowed to just step in again and give a more dedicated answer to that question, it's not only a question about image quality. Of course, image quality is a main focus, but it's also having producing a right tool for the user, for the job, for the project itself, and being able to not only do great image quality, but having the right accessories available for you. You went through it with brilliantly, Neil. For example, with the available ND filters, that you can go through that, and you can switch different settings on the fly. You can very adaptively go from an indoor setting to an outdoor setting, and keep the look, keep the what should we call it? Keep the dynamic range by changing the base ISO, not compromising in terms of your noise signal to noise level, even by doing so. And that's something we haven't been able to do with previous cameras. So it's, of course, image quality is very important to Sony, and we produce our own sensors, so we want them to be the best. But it's also putting all of this into a camera that can do a lot of more things for a production as a whole than just making good pictures. And that's what we believe is making a great camera and making a great tool for the photographer.
Yeah, 100%. I mean,
Thanks, Tony.
yeah,
I wouldn't want to do
100%.
audio. I didn't want to do audio on a DSLR camera, for example.
Yeah, I think the cameras that Crossworks is comparing it to is the R5, which I think is silly because nobody's seen it yet. The fact that Canon have limited that to C-Log, I think, is kind of showing the amount of dynamic range you're going to be able to get out of the camera. Obviously, it can do PQ or PG? I can't remember which one it is, which other gamma you can shoot in. But we can't really compare cameras that aren't out yet to cameras that are. The S1H is different. Obviously, that does perform really well as well. But again, like you guys have just said, the usability is one thing that's completely different. And just because the sensor's not performing the same, you can't really compare. It's like comparing apples and oranges, really. You know, the form factor of the S1H in comparison to the FX9, you know, you're not going to be able to have, if you're a working cameraman and you pull that out of the bag every day, the S1H you're going to be putting out, there's going to be bits that aren't going to be working because you're going to have to properly jerry-rig that together to get it working. Whereas, obviously, with the FX9, you know you're going to be able to put it out of the bag and it's going to work without too many moving parts attached to it not working. So I think, yeah, I mean, S1H sensor performance versus FX9, interesting. I want to test the raw output on the FX9 before making any kind of proper judgments. But from all the testing that I've done and all the testing that I've seen, the FX9 is a fantastic little camera. Like, sensor-wise, it's brilliant. So, yeah. But the S1H, very, very compelling option as well for the people who can deal with that form factor.
I think the Dolby PQ curve that you mentioned for HDR is it's more of a delivery form curve that for,
I'm not
for
sure
use in
what that's
post-production.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that's limited to, but yeah, C-Log is limited to, I think it's 11 stops. So it's, you know, nowhere near as much as S-Log can do. Obviously, and then obviously the fuller fat C-Log profiles. They are annoyed with so much more true, yeah, but when it is, yeah, again, it's just two different cameras, but sensors, I get it. Any more questions? Let us know in the YouTube or in the Discord. We will get them answered. But yeah, have you got anything else planned, Neil, in terms of the rest of the presentation?
If there's people who want to, if there's anybody who wants to have a look at any particular functions of the camera, for instance, variable ND, the look of the camera, the title of the session was about the full frame side of it, but I don't mind going off into some of the other functions of the camera if people are interested. Shall I just skip through a few of those bits?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I'll just pick out a couple of highlights, as it were,
cool,
just to keep us all off the streets. Okay, so I won't go into all the I'll just the hot topics, as it were. Obviously, autofocus in the shooting menu, and there's a focus menu page there. Well, autofocus just seems to work extremely well. As you can imagine, there are settings the transition speed to be from one focus point to another. and how jittery you want it to be, how responsive it needs to be. And I just thought I'd try and explain some of the graphics that appear in your viewfinder when you're using the focus, because you do tend to find screen boxes which can be a bit confusing. And just as a reminder of what they mean, a grey box means a face that is available for a selection, if you like. It recognises it as a face, but it hasn't done anything with that face. A white box over on the left here is a face that has been recognised and is the current target of the autofocus and is in focus. The orange line underneath it doesn't actually mean anything to do with the actual focus. The cursor is pointing. So you have a cursor that's operated by the little the sort of nipple button on the hand grip of the camera, or the up, down, right, left buttons on the side of the camera. And you can move the focus to a different subject by moving the orange line using the left and right buttons to select a different face. And then finally, the double white box is not only is the face recognized and targeted, it is registered as a priority face, and the camera will return to that face whenever it recognizes it in shot, assuming you've got the face detect autofocus mode switched on. So that's just a very quick guide to what the hell all those bits and pieces mean in terms of stuff in the viewfinder. Variable ND is pretty much the same as it is on the FS2 and indeed on the FS5, where it kind of first appeared. Minimum of 2 stops of ND in order to engage the variable. And it does have this auto ND function where you can control the exposure by using the ND. So if you've got some ancient venerable click-stopped lens on the front of your camera that's gives you the vintage look that you're after, rather than having to change your aperture in clicks of a focus ring, an iris ring on the lens, you can actually use the ND filter to control your exposure, and you can also use the auto ND function. So you kind of get an auto iris function on a completely manual lens. I shouldn't say auto iris, I should say auto exposure function. And of course, it will vary your exposure without changing the depth of field, which is quite a neat trick. And of course, many people are aware that you could also use that auto ND function in conjunction with the manual iris in order to do a depth of field pull by changing the iris manually and having the auto respond and keep the exposure constant. And as you change the exposure, change the aperture, but keep the exposure constant, your depth of field will change. So if you can sneak a depth of field pull into your program, well done to you.
So Crosswalks just said some rumors go around that the screen supports touch, but it's just not activated. Is this true? This is true, isn't it? It does. You will. That's something that the engineers are exploring, isn't it?
That is true. That in theory, technically, it is a touch screen. Whether or not that's implemented, you'll have to come back and listen to Daniel in a week to 10 days time when he updates on the version 2 and what's in it and what isn't. But I have no knowledge of whether they're going to implement that. All I know is that technically speaking, it is actually a touchscreen unit. Whether that can be enabled or not, we'll wait and see. Oh, just one thing on the variable ND. I think in the factory mode, as it comes out of the factory, as you open the ND up and you want to go a bit brighter and you take the ND out, it'll automatically crash out of the ND mode 2 stops of constant ND that's in the background in the variable mode, which can be a bit of a surprise. There is a menu in the technical settings of the camera that tells it not to do that, so that when you hit the end of the variable ND range, it just stops rather than crashing out the variable ND filter and making everything 2 stops brighter when you weren't expecting it, which is something that's caught me out before, and I did find a technical menu that stops it doing that. Again, just skipping through very quickly, the look of the image on the FX9. People have said it looks very nice, and I think they're right. It does look very nice. Traditionally, Sony cameras have been had a bit of criticism for maybe looking a bit too real, and sometimes we can't have the truth. We just want something that looks a bit nicer than that. And this camera has a way of doing that when it's in the custom mode. In the custom mode, traditionally you relied on a 709 style color matrix and a 709 style gamma or variant thereof. There's a new Cinetone gamma and the new Cinetone matrix in the paint settings of the camera when you're in the custom mode. Custom mode, don't forget, is the opposite of the log mode. In the log mode, we shoot log and we normally put a lookup table on top of it, and basically it looks nice with the S709 lookup table that we stole from the Venice camera, and that's always been pretty damn good, really. That way of working log with a nice lookup table on it has never been a problem. But traditionally, using the what you see is what you video style of shooting with custom mode, people have criticised the images for being a little not looking as nice as they might do. I think that argument goes when you put the custom mode Cinetone gamma in place and switch the S709, sorry, the Cinetone matrix on as well. And this diagram is probably made slightly overcomplicated. Kind of is trying to tell you that if you use log encoding with a 709 lookup table and then put a 709 LUT on it, you get to this sort of color space here. And if you put custom mode and just put the Cinetone settings on it, you get to this sort of color space here. Similar, not quite the same, but they're very much in the same ballpark. So you're getting a nice place. The nice place that you get to using Cinetone in custom mode gives you less flexibility in the edit. You get to a nice place and you're pretty much stuck there. Whereas going to a nice place with the S709 lookup table, you can move that image around in this whole log space area, if you like, as much as you like. You've got a load of adjustment available to you in the background. And that's kind of sorted that out. For some reason, the gamma curve in the camera is labeled as gamma category original. Why they've called it original, I honestly don't know. Really weird. But basically, it's Cinetone mode, and that's the one you would normally select. So basically, if you're shooting in a what you see custom mode, use the S Cinetone gamma, set the color matrix to S Cinetone as well, and Bob's your uncle. You can see here there is a bit of between S709, which is the curve, than the Cinetone curve, which is here, and is the nice steep 709 curve that just goes straight into the clips unless you put an E in there. 3 different flavors there, but 2 of them give you a particularly nice result here. And 709 gamma still in place. I'm a bit old-fashioned. Still believe that 709 gamma, given a relatively low contrast scene, will give you a very good result. Lookup tables. There's a quirk in the lookup tables of the camera that it's worth mentioning as well. The lookup tables, I drew this diagram and somebody put it on Facebook while I wasn't looking, and it wasn't supposed to go anywhere really, to be honest, and people then piled in to say, how dare people produce this kind of overcomplicated nonsense. It may be overcomplicated, but it's true. And what it's trying to tell you is that there are a couple of switches in the lookup table settings of the camera, and it's a little bit complicated to work out what's going on. Basically, if you're in UHD mode, tables are a bit different to if you're in HD mode. In UHD mode, you can select them to be on all the outputs at once or none of the outputs. It's a bit of an all or nothing kind of situation, which is the way you would normally work. and you wouldn't have a lookup table on your main XQD recording. You would just have it on the monitoring outputs. You can put it on the main XQD recording as well and burn it in if you want to, but it seems a bit of an odd way of working. And then if you're in HD mode, it is a little bit peculiar, because in HD mode, your lookup tables are either on everything, including the XQD card and all the outputs, or they're on nothing. And that's it, all or nothing. And those are the only two options you have, really. So what you would normally do is you would leave the lookup table switched off, and you would switch on something called Viewfinder Gamma Assist, which puts effectively a lookup table just in the viewfinder, but not on the other outputs. So that enables you to see a LUTed output directly from the viewfinder while you're recording your clean S-Log3 onto your XQD cards. I'm not sure if that makes sense to people, but as I say, it is a little bit overcomplicated. It wasn't really designed to go out, but it was just for me, really, but it does the job. One word of caution: if you are in HD mode, you can use the HD lookup tables on everything, and you can also add the Viewfinder Gamma Assist viewfinder at the same time, which you end up double LUTed, and it gets a bit confusing. So you just need to be a bit careful in the setup of your lookup tables. Quick word about image stabilization. You can, with a camera, you can compensate for a wobbly camera operator by wobbling the elements of the lens in the cancel it out. You could wobble the sensor to cancel it out. You could wobble your image in camera or in post-production. Or what we do with this particular camera is we make a note of how the camera wobbled and then use that data to correct it in post, which sounds a bit laborious, but actually it isn't. The data of what happened at the front end is recorded by the gyros and the camera into the metadata, and programs like Catalyst Browse that I was using before there is now a stabilize window where you can just click on the stabilize button and it will very, very quickly stabilize the image for you using that data. And rather than being a processing intensive business where it's looking at every pixel and trying to work out what the hell happened, because it's got that metadata and it tells it what happened, it can do that very quickly. That has to be rendered out, which can take time depending on the file and so on. But it's actually a very useful way of working. And Catalyst Browse is free to download a piece of software. I think Sony have made a terrible mistake there. Normally it's £2,000 minimum for anything from Sony. For some reason, Catalyst Browse is free. Oh, just a word, you can't use in-lens image stabilization and the metalization time. It's one or the other. And not all lenses will work because it needs information on the focal length of the lens in order to generate the correct metadata. There's a camera adapter coming along shortly for the camera, the XDCA FX9. I have to say it's a bit of an ugly lump, but it does the job. And that will give you a 16-bit RAW output from the camera. Now, what that's connected to, hopefully our friends at Atomos will have something ready and you can connect it into there. But that's a little way down the line yet. So I'm always, this is just a personal thing, a little bit less than enthusiastic about external RAW boxes and connecting them up and repowering them and working with lots of external widgetry and so on. To me, the best solution is that of the Venice camera, where you dock the AXS recorder onto it and it works a treat, and you plug it in and you just go. But that's a different budget window altogether, so that's not for everybody. So it'll be interesting to see how these third-party applications work with the camera. Okay. Just a word on power. It uses a little more power than the FS7, The FS7 is taking about 20 watts. The FX9 about 35 watts, so it's quite a chunk more. So the batteries will go down. It's more processing, doing more stuff. I'm afraid there's nothing for free in life, except dual base ISO for some reason. And a number of manufacturers have built adapters so that you can put a BP, a V-lock battery on the back end of the camera. First out of the box was Hawkwoods with this device here. Then along came Core SWX and then Wooden Camera, and they all do basically the same thing in different. But they all kind of rely on converting the output of the battery to the 19.5 volt weird DC input the camera needs. There are various conspiracy theories around that Sony had a massive pile of 19.5 volt power supplies left in a warehouse somewhere, and that's why it's 19.5 volt DC input on the camera. Don't think that's probably true. I hope not. But it is a bit of an oddity, and that's why these external adapter boxes typically have these kind of flying lead that connects into the DC input of the camera. I'll probably leave it there, I think. But if anybody's got any questions about any of the points raised or wants to go through any of those general again, just let me know, really. Okay, thanks, folks. Any further questions?
Yeah, we've got another one from YouTube. Can you adjust individual colors in the FX9? For example, the A7 III has color depth, but not individual saturation. Also, what reasons behind only having that kind of limited control?
Sorry, color saturation.
Yeah, it's in Discord if you want to read it.
Color saturation is not something you typically do sort of in camera. I mean, you can do it to a degree using the in the camera. Using the multi-matrix, you've got an extreme level of camera control in terms of the way your looks and its colorimetry. But if you're shooting log, for instance, the basic rule is capture it and do all that stuff in post, really. If you want to change the saturation of the image live at the front end and bake it in, that's a bit of a dangerous way to go, really, I would have thought.
I think. Yeah, other than that, mate, I don't think there's any other questions, to be honest with you. Anyone else got any more? Put them in the put them in YouTube or put them in Discord. If not, I think we could call it a day there, mate. If you want, it's up to you.
Yeah, I can hang around for a bit in case anybody has a question or two.
Yeah, I can see Jack Bauer Power is typing something. Maybe it might be relative to the R5 question he had. But when is the new firmware coming?
Week to 10 days.
There you go.
Oh, sorry, no, that's not when it's coming. That's when it'll be announced.
Ah, okay, cool.
Sorry.
That's right. Yeah, he's just asking about the R5 specs, but I think, yeah, they look good, but yeah, we'll have to wait and see how the actual camera comes out. But yeah, all right, I think that's probably it, Neil. I think there's, people are leaving and there's no other questions.
Good.
So, yeah, mate.
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming, everybody. Any further questions, just post them in the common room and I'll keep an eye open.
Perfect. Thanks for joining us, guys. Catch you later.